Well, good afternoon to you again. This is Professor Andy McIntosh wanting to share with you the wonders of creation in the world of feathers. As before, I'm going to hide myself now in the top right-hand corner so that you can see the slides. What I want to do is to speak to you about the amazing world of flight. I've always loved flight. Ever since I was a child, I've always loved aeroplanes and anything to do with aeroplanes. Here's the Tornado, which was an aircraft that I worked on at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Bedford. It's no longer a government institution. A lot of the wind tunnels that we use then have been mothballed, and I'm afraid the place no longer exists as it used to. But I've always been interested in aircraft, and I spent my time at the Royal Aircraft Establishment really learning about aerodynamics. There's still our Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, which you may have heard of, where there is an air show which takes place every few years. And I've loved anything to do with airflow and aviation. My work was actually on combustion, where I looked at the mathematical modeling of airflow with combustion, and in particular looked at noise as well as combustion. So I've always enjoyed working with aeroplanes, and as you well know, for my first talk that I gave, I was talking about the bombardier beetle as well as the amazing things that we can learn about spray systems from the bombardier beetle. Well, with the work at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, I was working on wind tunnels, and I was working on the Tornado, as I've just mentioned, and also what became the Eurofighter and other aeroplanes which have been made since, which have what we call strakes at the front of the wings, which are separate surfaces in order to help that aircraft really in the transonic region. And I became a professor of thermodynamics and combustion in the year 2000. And now I'm an emeritus professor, which means that they don't pay me for any work I do. That's basically what happens. But I want to talk to you about the amazing world of feathers. Remember, as I mentioned, that I've written this book, The Wonders of Creation, with Professor Stuart Burgess, and there's a whole section there on flight. I've also written the book Genesis for Today on the extreme right, which shows to you the theological reasons why we must keep to a biblical position on creation, a straightforward 6 literal day creation. My friend and colleague, Professor Stuart Burgess, has written a book called The Hallmarks of Design, and there's a nice section on aviation and aircraft in that. So please do consider looking at those books when you have opportunity. The section on flight is illustrated there, which I've written. And of course, you can see some of the diagrams of feathers, which I will refer to in this talk. I could ask you a few questions concerning, did you know? Did you know how feathers work on birds? They are really remarkable. There's a lovely picture of a red kite by my friend Colin Mitchell there on the bottom right. And these feathers are just remarkable, whether they come from birds of prey, like the red kite, or whether they come from tiny little hummingbirds or huge birds like eagles. Did you know that every feather is there in a particular location, and no two feathers, even on the same bird, are identical? It's very important that every feather, you understand, is precisely located exactly where it should be. Location is important. So no two feathers are the same. As you look at this picture, you will see that there are flight feathers, which are the green feathers, colored green, obviously just for the sake of this diagram, not in general. You don't see birds with a coloring system quite like this. No, what I've just done this just to highlight that different feathers are there for different reasons. All the green ones are essentially flight feathers, particularly the outer ones. Then you've got what we call covert feathers, or we could use the word covering. It's linked with the word covering. And you've got in German Deckungen. So these are primary covering feathers. Then you've got median covering feathers, then lesser covering feathers. And in the primary section, you've got in the primary feathers, the flight feathers, the green ones, you've got primary, secondary as you come in, and then tertiary. Now, all those feathers are there for a reason. And this is what I find remarkable when people try to tell me that it's usually some poor dinosaur that they reckon gradually emerged with feathers. Frankly, they need to ask themselves some scientific questions. To what purpose and to what advantage would it be to have a broken set of fibers where your scales had been on a reptile like a small dinosaur? What advantage would there be? Not just for maybe swiping at some food that you're trying to gather. Frankly, that's absurd. We're actually thinking of some advantage to flight. Well, there is no advantage until you've got all the feathers in the right place. You're not going to get a stable flying system unless you've got the flight feathers there, as well as the covering feathers, as well as the outer and the secondary and the tertiary flight feathers. And please note that you also need a tail, because if you don't have a tail, there's not going to be what we call longitudinal stability. So the whole notion of emerging feathers by accident is frankly very foolish indeed. We need to understand then that all feathers are there for a reason. No two feathers are the same. But of course, as we consider the wings that we make, they're generally not made of feathers. They will be made of some sort of metal or wood, which is how things started. And there will be a force going upwards against the turning of the flow, which is what I taught my final year students at the University of Leeds when I was lecturing there at the university. So there is a force against the turning of the flow, which pushes that aerofoil upwards as the flow is turned. The force, the lift force, is due to Newton's third law of reaction. It actually could be anything that's turning the flow. You could have some sort of a charged flow in some way, ions, which are charged particles, which could be turned by a magnet. And you'd still get this force as long as you've got the turning of the flow. People get into difficulty trying to explain lift. Lift is simply a reactionary force where there is any turning of the flow. So here I've got a picture of an Airbus A300, and you can see the various aerofoil shapes, the slat or the forward flap. Then you've got the backward facing flap. Then you've got the main wing that you can see there, as well as a little vertical aerofoil, which we'll come to, which is an interesting addition in the last 20, 30 years of flight, commercial flight. I'll come to that. That is actually there in order to save fuel. But let's just think about the shape of an aerofoil. Remember that really we're dealing with feathers in the natural world. So as we consider the aerofoil, we need to realize that, of course, it's not being made of metal, it's not being made of wood, it's being made of these feathers that I've just been telling you. Everyone is not the same as its neighbor. So you're going to fill up all the aerofoil with feathers. And please notice that as you look end on at this aerofoil, you can see that it's thicker at the front and thinner at the back. So it's not just looking downwards where we consider where each of the feathers were primary, secondary, tertiary, covering feathers, tail feathers. You've actually got to make sure that as you look end on, you've got a thicker aerofoil at the front. This is a picture I took on the Isle of Mull of a white-tailed eagle. As you can see, it's got a white tail, and in English it's called a white-tailed eagle. They were reintroduced. I think they were originally from Scandinavia, and we'd had them centuries before, but we'd lost them all in Scotland. So now they've been reintroduced. Wonderful birds. Please notice the thickness of the wing at the front. We'll come to the winglets, which I mentioned earlier, which are the bits which go upwards at the sides of the wing. But we'll come to those winglets. But please notice the roundness of the lead part of the aerofoil, that is the wing. And here it really shows it. This is another picture of the white-tailed eagle, showing that beautiful curved surface at the leading edge of this white-tailed eagle. The aerodynamic excellence of birds is frankly awe-inspiring. And I think all people who look at birds who know a bit about aerodynamics, which is my subject, and I do know a bit about it, can see immediately that birds have an incredible design. And it was due to looking at gulls, I believe, on the north or on the east coast of America, that Wilbur Wright and his brother Orville Wright, but particularly Wilbur, looked at the birds and realized that the way he needed to build his first powered flight, which was, of course, in 1903, was going to only be achieved by understanding what birds were doing. And he marvelously made a wind tunnel which enabled him to measure the forces for a curved surface. That is just amazing to do that in 1903. And because he understood the way the birds were achieving their fantastic flying capabilities, like this red kite here, taken by my friend Colin Mitchell, then he got his ideas as to how to warp the surface on the Wright Flyer that they built there in 1903 in North Carolina. It was just an incredible achievement. And here this red kite again shows its aerodynamic prowess and its great agility as it dives for food at the Gigrin Farm feeding centre, where we encouraged the red kites to come back to Wales. They've now come back in great force. Let's look at some other birds. Here are some amazing birds called gannets. In German, they are called Bastopol, and this is at St Kilda in Scotland. They are just fantastic birds. The reason why I've highlighted these is that my friend, another friend in this case, Bob Buckley, took these pictures, not mine. But they have an amazing ability to dive and to become very sharp pencil-like objects, and they go into the water to get their food. And here's some gannets shown in this picture, which is an amalgamation of 2 or 3 pictures all put together, where you can see the gannets diving and becoming rather like pencils just before they reach the water. And they've got swing wings, and that's another amazing event, amazing ability to be able to dive into the water like that. Not only, of course, do gannets do that, but the peregrine falcon is particularly known for its fantastic diving ability. It will plummet at something around 200 miles per hour, which in your units is about 320 kilometers per hour, and even over that speed. So it's diving at a phenomenal speed, so much so that it has to have special eyelids on its eyes, which are transparent. It's a second set of eyelids, which still enable it to see, but without its eyeball watering. And it dives at this amazing speed onto its unsuspecting prey. It doesn't always win, but often they are able to catch a smaller bird out of the air. So that's another bird which has tremendous diving capability. The fastest bird recorded in level flight is a bird which we call the swift. You call it Maursegler. And this is taken by Colin Mitchell again in Bournemouth. And the speed of this bird has been recorded in level flight. This is not in a dive, but level flight, to be somewhere up just over 110 kilometers per hour, about just under 70 miles per hour, which is a huge speed. It's the speed of our cars on the motorway, unless you're driving a little bit over the limit, at least in England. But all birds have amazing aerodynamic possibilities. The swifts are noted for their arrow-like wings and very, very fast flight. Perhaps the birds which I particularly enjoy watching, and I had the privilege of seeing this particular Antillean crested hummingbird in St. Lucia in February 2020. These hummingbirds are wonderful aerodynamic marvels, which of course have the ability to hover, and they are twisting their wings as well as flapping them, usually of the order of 50 to 60 times per second, but they can go right up to 100, 150 times per second. So that's what these birds, the hummingbirds, are noted for, their ability to hover and to stay in that single position, which the naked eye cannot actually follow. The speed is so fast. So all you see is a bird stationary with the wings as a blur. Well, let me ask you the question. So did birds emerge from some reptile, like this wonderful lizard that I took a picture of out in Africa? Well, we need to realize that the keratin, which bird feathers are made from, and it's true that scales of reptiles are also made from keratin, but that there the similarity ends. The material may be the same, but the construction is entirely different. The construction of a feather is nothing like the construction of the keratin of a reptilian scale. So when Douglas Fatumia said in his book Evolutionary Biology, the feather has the same fundamental structure and development as a reptilian scale, was he correct? Well, the answer is no, he was totally wrong, because what he was trying to argue is that the structure on the left is the same, or in principle is the same as the structure on the right. The difference is enormous, because what you've got on the right is the scales, which are purposely overlapping to give really as some armor plating almost on a scale of a dinosaur or a lizard that we have today. Pretty tough material. But on the feather, it's made of tubes. The main shaft down the middle is a hollow tube. Then there are hollow tubes coming out from the main shaft. And these, of course, are barbs. We call them barbs. But that's not all. From the barbs come barbules, which are small, very, very small, so small that you can barely see them with the naked eye. It just looks like a bit of fur. But they are most important because the left-handed barbules on this picture are actually hooks, and the right-handed barbules, which are virtually horizontal on this picture on the right of the barb, sorry, on the right of the shaft, you've got the barbs, and then on the left of the barbules, it would be going vertical, are hooks, which you can just see. You can mainly see the horizontal barbules, which are the right-hand going barbules, which are ridges. So the hooks of the left-handed barbules slide over the ridges of the right-handed barbules. Well, it's the structure which is everything in feathers. Indeed, feathers don't grow like scales. They grow from tiny little follicles, which are actually beneath the skin, whereas the scales are really lying virtually in the same place as the skin or just on top of the skin. Now, scales are not primitive. Scales perform the function they're designed for, to protect the reptile and to enable the reptile to heat up actually in the sun. So that's partly why the scales are there. They're there for protection, but also to enable the creature to heat up well. Whereas feathers are virtually the reverse, because feathers are not hard wearing, really. They are fragile matters. They actually do wear very well, but they're not for armament in any way. They're not for, in that sense, for protection. If teeth come along, they'll easily go through feathers, right? So that's not really what the feather's for. And neither is a feather there for the purposes of heating up the creature. Indeed, it acts in reverse. It tends to insulate the bird from a lot of cold weather. And if it's very, very hot, it also stops the bird from heating up too much. Not that that's the primary concern for the feathers or purpose of the feathers. The primary purpose, of course, is for flight. Now, as the feather grows, it grows within the follicle, and the barb ridges are actually formed, as well as the barbs and the main shaft of the feather. It's absolutely extraordinary. Probably the best way is to go to this diagram here. You have what we call the follicle, which is the tube, and inside the tube is the feather cylinder, which is growing inside the tube. Now, if I play this next little clip, you can see a model growing inside the follicle. The grey-white diagram, part of the diagram is the feather, and the brown is the follicle. So you see that the feather grows inside, then it comes to the top of the follicle, keeps on pushing out, and you actually then see the feather placed in position. Now, this becomes evident when you actually look at the wing, in this case of a pigeon, where this is a young pigeon, where you can see the shiny surface on the right is the follicle, very thin bit of keratin, and you can see the feather emerging from the tube. Do you see? Now, that once it's placed in its correct position, And remember that feathers are not necessarily symmetrical. The tail feathers are symmetrical. The flight feathers, the tertiary ones, are fairly symmetrical. Secondary, less so. And primary, very, very bent on one side, very small shafts on one side, long shafts on the other, because they're very curved. And every feather, I said, is not identical to its neighbor. And once the feather has come out of the follicle, it's placed in the right position, doesn't disturb the feather next to it because of the follicle protecting the main barbs from actually interfering with adjacent feathered barbs. So it's very carefully placed in the right place on the wing. And there is no evolution. Kind of evolution. There is no particular place that you could say had an advantage in this evolutionary story. In other words, why have those follicles emerging from under the skin, right, and still maintaining that tube shape if there wasn't a reason? Well, there is a reason, because you don't want an adjacent feather to interfere with the growth of the feather next to it. So everything has a reason. There is no evolution here. It's showing every evidence of design. Well, let me ask you another question. Do you know just how one feather hangs together? I've already hinted at the answer to this question, but let me ask you again. How does one feather hang together? Well, it's due to this structure that I've already referred to, where you've got barbules, you've got hooks, you've got hooked barbules and ridged barbules. You've got the main shaft, or the rachis, which is shown here in this detailed circular diagram. So coming out from the shaft, you've got the barbs, right? And then from the barbs, you have barbules, right? So each barb, right, coming out from the rachis, so what you've called featherast, is coming from the feather shaft, which is the main shaft, the rachis of the feather. Then you've got the barbs, the featherast coming from the barbs, and then only visible when you really get a microscope on it, you've got hooked barbules, in this case, going from leftward facing, and then the right going barbules have basically ridges on them, a bit like curtain rails. So the left-handed barbules, having hooks, slide over the right-handed barbules, the Borgenstrahlen, which means that you've got hooks sliding over curtain rails, very similar to hanging a curtain on a curtain rail. So that means that the feather can bend with the wind and bend with the forces exerted against it. But it does mean that the bird has to have the ability to actually make sure that it oils those feathers. And although I'm not going to show it in this talk, a bird has the ability to put its beak on a gland right at the base of its spine and to put oil over the feathers to make sure that that mechanism doesn't get worn. So that's a very important necessity for a bird, to have the ability to get oil on its feathers, and it keeps them waterproof as well. So here's another diagram of the same principle. It's a magpie secondary feather. You can tell because it's got a white tip at the top, and it's also got a beautiful, you can see the iridescent shining part of the feather on the top right, which is due to another principle, due to the light reflecting at different ways according to the layering of the keratin. So in some places it will produce a green, some places it will produce a black, which is pigment, and other places it will produce a blue, depending on the interaction between the layering of the transparent pigments. It's absolutely incredible when you consider the colorings, which are not just due to pigment, but are due to iridescence. That's the way the light is broken up under reflection. So please now also look at the right-hand side, where you can see again the hooks, in this case on the left-handed barbules, sliding over the ridges of the right-handed barbules. This is frankly extraordinary. The right-handed barbules are acting like curtain rails, as I mentioned earlier, whereas the left-handed barbules are acting like curtain hooks, sliding over the curtain rails. Well, what made the left-handed barbules have hooks and the right-handed barbules have ridges? There would be no pressure from an evolutionary point of view to do this if you've just got a reptile with frayed keratin scales, which is what is argued by evolutionists for the origin of feathers. Frankly, it's absurd. And here's a picture that David Menton took many years ago of the barbules, the hooked barbules, sliding over the ridged barbules of a feather under the electron microscope. Another picture here, which just helps you to understand this. And yet another picture here of a supposedly, and I don't agree with the dates, of supposedly 99 million year old amber, in which is trapped none else but a feather. This is from the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, and amazingly trapped in the amber is a feather, which when you look at it under the magnifying glass shows exactly the same principle of ridges and hooks that you find in barbules of feathers that we have today. Everything is telling you that feathers have always been feathers, which is why Professor Richard Dawkins couldn't really answer the question properly when he was quizzed by Jonathan Miller on our BBC broadcasting TV station way back in 2005. Richard Miller called his program A Brief History of Disbelief. A very neutral title, would you not agree? Not neutral at all. Brief History of Disbelief. So he asked Richard Dawkins, well, what exactly made the little pimp of keratin, you know, this little button of keratin, to become a feather? And Richard Dawkins struggles and says, well, there must be a reason. You can't, unless you've got a reason, that wouldn't have happened. And he's struggling really for words. And he says, almost in exasperation at one point, well, I suppose it's a matter of faith on my part. Well, of course, it's a matter of blind faith on his part, because he hasn't got any reason, even in evolutionary terms, which I don't accept, there's no evolutionary pressure to make a scale into a feather, because the creature is perfectly well designed as it is to get its food on land. It's never had a thought in its head, and certainly the DNA has had no thought, because it's just random mutations you're appealing to make a feather out of the keratin which made a scale. Everything is frankly not adding up when you consider the origin of feathers. Feathers have always been feathers and always will be feathers. Feathers found in the amber that I showed you are the same, essentially, as flight feathers, I should say, today. Flight feathers which have this hook and ridge structure to keep them together. Some feathers, of course, are down and just there for insulation only. Not all feathers are for flight purposes. Well, here's another feather in amber. This time, it's supposedly 25 million years old. I believe they've actually, all of them, the amber has come from the flood. It's come from catastrophic burial. It's nothing to do with gradual change. But even if you were to say that the dates were right, like the 99 million year old, I don't accept it. But even if you were to say that it was 99 million years old, it's not changed. Here's one 25 million years old, and again, it's not changed. The modern feather is exactly the same in principle as the flight feather, which is trapped in the amber. There is no evolution. Well, let me ask you now another question about feathers. Another question. Did you know that owls fly very quietly? Did you know the reason why they fly so quietly? We're going to look at the Schleiereule, the barn owl in English. Beautiful creature. We could talk a lot about owls. Like all birds of prey, generally they have stereoscopic vision. Both eyes focus on the same thing, give a slightly different angle, which enables distance to be measured. And distance is very important when you're a bird of prey, trying to judge how fast you need to be going and where your prey is. Well, the quietness of owl feathers is frankly extraordinary, as this clip will show you. I'm going to play it now.
Good girl.
Moses. Mo.
And now, it's Kenza's turn.
Shh.
Did you hear it?
Pretty cool. No, nothing at all. Absolutely quiet.
It was amazing.
But what have the microphones picked up? The decibel waveforms show the sound being generated by the birds in flight. Each spike is an individual wing beat. But with the barn owl, there's almost nothing.
Yeah.
Even our array of super-sensitive microphones fail to pick up any sound of Kenza in flight.
And here's the owl doing exactly the same. Nothing. Nothing at all. I'll play it again.
There's not a sound.
Yes.
That is really impressive,
Yeah.
isn't it?
It shows that they really are silent flyers.
So how does a barn owl fly so silently? When air moves, it generates sound. The more movement, the greater the sound. The pigeon's large body and small wings mean it can't stay airborne without a lot of fast flapping. This creates turbulence in the feathers below. The peregrine has much larger wings, which it uses to build up speed and chase down its prey. the barn owl is far more graceful. Kenza's large wings and small body make it easier for her to generate lift. So just one gentle wing beat sees her gliding effortlessly through the air, creating little more than a whisper in the feathers below.
So, friends, I played that clip because it beautifully explains what's going on with these particular type of feathers, peculiar to owls. We're dealing here with flight feathers, which I've already told you are the feathers right on the outside of the wing. You do have primary, secondary, and tertiary, which you can see going along the wing as you go inwards. But there is a comb and fringe arrangement at the edge of the feathers. The comb is at the front of the wing, and the trailing edge has a fringe which breaks up the turbulence which usually is coming from wings. It's a very ragged look. In fact, if you take an owl wing, it feels very, very soft. And that's because you've got this leading edge comb. I'll show you a detail of that in a moment. And you've also got a trailing edge fringe, which is on these feathers. So if we now look in greater detail at the leading edge, you'll see this comb that I referred to. This is peculiar to owl feathers. And the secret is that the air is forced between these combs, between each fringe of the comb. And that means that it's not generating as much turbulence, as well as the trailing edge fringe as well. So you've got the comb and the fringe going on here. This is brilliant engineering. Indeed, again, it shows that you haven't got evolution going on here, because you've got to have this structure for this particular type of bird. Indeed, when people understood owl wings, they understood how to make wind turbines, which you have a lot of in Germany. We have quite a few here, but you've really gone to town in Germany. I've seen a lot of them when I visited your country, and also in Denmark, not far away from you. You have a lot of wind turbines, and some of them are now being made quieter by the inspiration achieved from looking at owls. So we've got a picture of a barn owl here again, and you can see the comb structure, which is not far from the leading edge, just a little distance down the leading edge. So it acts like a comb, as I showed you earlier, and the air is carefully encouraged to go down particular channels and then to leave on this fringe arrangement on the edge of the wing, the trailing edge of the wing. This breaks up the little eddies into very, very small eddies, so the overall turbulence is an awful lot less. There is no evolution of these types of feathers. It needs, dare I say it, a mind. Yes, the word mind is important. You need design. You need a mind which knows how to work aerodynamics. I've already said to you a feather is an amazing, miraculous bit of keratin anyway. Now I'm talking about amazing extra features which are found specifically in owls. Let me ask you one last question. I've already referred to this. Do you know how feather color is produced? Like we get on a peacock, this beautiful peacock. You see the male bird strutting around. We have the phrase in English, strutting around like a peacock. I'm sure you have a similar phrase in German, where you've got this beautiful display. And when you actually see the peahen, the female, it barely takes any notice of this display. Yes, it says, okay, so you're a male. So what? You know, it's not really that interested in all the details, but they are frankly hugely impressive to humans as we look at the colors. The color is, as I said to you earlier, provided by iridescent coloring. When you look at the peacock eye, the center part is a cardioid made of the blue and the beautiful fluorescent green, right? There's different shades of blue merging into a fluorescent green. Then you've got brown, which is a pigment not produced by iridescence. Then you've got different pigments starting in different places. Now, just see what's happening. Just take the pigment colors to begin with, not the iridescent ones, just the pigment colors. As they grow through the barb, the image is staying the same as the individual barb changes from yellow to brown and back to yellow. That is staggering. Now, the image has got to stay the same as the barb grows through it. But of course, as I've indicated, it gets worse, because when you look at the blue and the iridescent green, these are colors which are made from twin layers with the white light reflecting in a different way, depending how thick the second layer or how thick the distance is between the layers as the light is refracted, as this right-hand diagram indicates. There you've got the incident light, then it's bent, then it's totally internally reflected, then it's bent again. And depending which color it is, it's bent at a different angle, which is then what splits the light up into iridescent blues, iridescent greens, and so on and so forth. We had this when we were talking about the magpie with the iridescent coloring. And this is all being done while the feather is growing through the actual eye, the peacock eye. Frankly, we just stand back in wonder as we say, this is not evolution. This is design by an almighty God. In fact, Darwin is recorded as saying, the sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick, because he cannot see the real advantage in terms of evolutionary pressure, in terms of reproduction desire of a peahen to have a more beautiful peacock or stronger one. Does he see any strength in it? He could see that, frankly, it's very difficult to make that argument. People have still tried to make that argument today, but it doesn't work, friends. Everything is telling you that added beauty is an indication that God has made these beautiful feathers and these beautiful creatures. So I end by saying, and quoting rather, the book of Job. Have you an arm like God? Can you thunder with a voice like him? You go and deck yourself now with majesty and excellency, and you go and array yourself with glory and beauty. Can you do that? No, you can't, Job. Pictures here of woodpeckers, hummingbirds, birds of paradise, the peacock and the peacock feather eye all tell us that God is the one behind all these wonderful creatures. We cannot do what God can do. Everything is telling you the truth of that verse in Romans 1:20. The invisible things of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. But you might say, but nature is red in tooth and claw. And we must be prepared for that argument, because people like David Attenborough have been written to by Christians saying, why don't you believe that in all this beauty pointing to God? And he would say, well, I can't believe it because I see terrible suffering in nature as well. As you can see, this kestrel is which is a bird of prey, is at the point of sadly eating this either little mouse or vole, which is going to be gobbled up. Suffering is there, brutality is there in nature. So we need to ask, where does this come from? Well, in Romans 8, it says, we know that the whole creation groans and travails in pain together until now. Why is this? Because in the beginning, the creation which was perfect was marred by Adam and Eve's sin. And God judged, not immediately Adam and Eve, he brought death into the world for them, but he brought death and destruction into the ground because he cursed the ground. And it says in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians 15 verses 21 and 22, for since by man came death, by man came also the resurrection from the dead. It's drawing a comparison between Adam, who brought death, including the death and destruction in the animal world, which is why I clearly believe that 1 Corinthians 15 is teaching that death of the animal world also came in. Romans 8, that I mentioned earlier, teaches that the whole creation groans and travails in pain together until now. So it's not only that, but of course death for men as well came in. Adam brought death, but in Christ all shall be made alive. This is the answer, friends. God's remedy is in fact the cross of Christ, where Jesus bled and died that we might be forgiven. We who brought death into the world are finally saved through the death of the perfect Son of God, who died taking our sin in our place. Thank you for listening. May God speak to you and bless you each one. I thoroughly enjoyed speaking with you, and I'll take questions shortly as I come on to the live recording. So I'm here available to answer questions, which I will do shortly.